My name is Sonu Bedi. I'm a member of the Legal Studies faculty group here and also associate professor in the government department. And it's my real pleasure to have for us today Todd Henderson delivering the Thurlow M. Gordon 1906 Memorial Fund. Oh, it's my real pleasure to have, can you hear now? Is that okay? Okay. So this is better, right? So it's my real pleasure to introduce Todd Henderson, who's going to be our Thurlow M. Gordon Memorial Fund lecturer today. And this is one of the lectures that the Legal Studies Working Group puts together. And so I want to thank that group. Also thank the Rockefeller Center and Joanne Needham for the logistics of this talk. Let me say a bit about this lecture. It's to remember Thurlow Gordon. He was Dartmouth class of 1906. He was a valedictorian. I bet at that time there was not 5 valedictorians. There was probably only 1. And he was a graduate of Harvard Law School. And he developed a practice focusing to a large extent on antitrust work and shared his time with numerous charitable organizations. And this memorial fund was established in his name in 1976 to bring recognized authorities in some field of law to campus for audience and discussions. And previous Thurlow M. Gordon lecturers include Neil Katyal and Judge Noonan on the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. So with that, I will make a quick introduction of Todd Henderson. He's a professor at the University of Chicago Law School. And so his research interests include corporations, security regulations, law and economics. He's taught a range of courses, right? Banking regulation to American Indian law, right? That's quite interesting. And he worked for several years designing and building dams in California before matriculating to law school, which is good because oftentimes you get folks that are in law school that really haven't done anything else before they go to law school. I should know, right? And so while he's at the law school, he's a member of the Law Review and also captained the law school's all-university champion intramural football team, right? So he graduated. Yeah, he graduated from Chicago with high honors, served as a judicial clerk for the Honorable Dennis Jacobs on the prestigious Second Circuit. He practiced appellate litigation at Kirkland Ellis and also worked at McKinsey & Company in Boston. So it is my great pleasure to introduce him as our Thurlow M. Gordon lecturer. The title of his talk is Hacking Trust, How the Social Technology of Cooperation Will Revolutionize Government.
You save the applause until the end, or maybe not even applause at the end. I hope that you, in the Q&A, which we'll have time for, will disagree with me. That makes it much more interesting. And hopefully be a start of a society in which we can disagree without, as President Obama said, being disagreeable. There's too much disagreeability these days, so let's all model disagreeing without being disagreeable. Thank you to the Rockefeller Center for that introduction, to Joanne and to Dartmouth for having me. The last time I was on campus was 30 years ago when I was an undergraduate at Princeton University. The conditions were much different on my end, and I never would have imagined coming back in this capacity, so it's a great honor to be here. So I want to talk about trust. If your mom was like my mom, one of the first things she told you when you were a kid was, don't get into a van with a stranger, even if they're offering you free candy. This is a bad idea. There's no way you can trust a stranger. Today, it's a little different. I've got little kids, and whenever my kids go up to some stranger, I say, stranger danger. So stranger danger is something that we are taught at a very young age. And unfortunately, this is very limiting for us. It is really great to be able to rely on strangers. Being able to rely on strangers gives us a lot more opportunities to do things. We want to travel from one part of the country to another part of the country. We don't have a car. We don't have a friend with a car, a family member with a car, and we need to get there. Wouldn't it be great if we could, like this guy, hit the open road, put out our thumb, and get from one place to another. Being able to rely on strangers opens up opportunities for us to cooperate with each other. Cooperate. You've got a car, I need a ride. And human cooperation, after all, is how we get things done. We can imagine the options for cooperation. We could say the first people that we are very easy to rely on cooperating with are our family. When we're born, we have a biological, inborn trust of our parents. We're totally helpless. I guess we don't have another choice, but we trust our family biologically and instinctively. Unfortunately, although we are all part of the human family, our direct biological family is pretty small. And if we could only rely on our family, we never would have gotten out of the caves. As we expand the possibilities of people we could cooperate with, your friends, you need a ride to the airport, you could ask a friend to take you. You might ask an acquaintance, someone in the government legal affairs department, say, could you give me a ride? But the possibilities of strangers giving you rides opens up a lot more value for you, a lot more choices. But of course, it's more costly to rely on a stranger. Think about just moving from family to friends. To create friendships is costly. You have to invest in them. You have to build those friendships and nurture them like a plant. And if you don't nurture them, you're not going to be able to rely on those people when you want them to do something for you. So cost is increasing as you leave your family, but so is value. Fortunately, the government came along and offered a solution to the ride with strangers problem. I'm sure everybody in here has been in a taxi cab. I remember the first time that I rode in a cab, I was in Manhattan. I grew up outside of Pittsburgh. I went to Manhattan and I was just marveled at the numbers of yellow taxi cabs and people getting in and out of strangers' cars to go places. I was probably 8 years old. And what a magical system the government gave us for cooperation. From the stranger in the van to the, here's a total stranger, I've never met this person, I don't know anything about them, and I'm willing to entrust my life to them riding from point A to point B. And the government solution here is a yellow color, a label on the top, a meter that can't be tampered with, some regulation in the background about licensing, and a promise that we're watching this person. So this is what this talk is about. Who can we trust? How is trust created? And what forces are at work in the supply and the demand of trust? I'm a Chicago person, so of course I think about things in terms of supply and demand. Humans are unique in the world among apes. Here's a group of gorillas, and you see they're all lounging about. These ones here have their backs turned to this other guy. That's because they know each other. They are in the same family unit. On the other hand, we happily go to bars on a Thursday night in Hanover, New Hampshire, and turn our back to other apes that we don't know, that we've never met. We trust strangers in a way that our great ape ancestors could not even fathom. In fact, humans are the only species that trusts the way that we do and cooperate across, outside of our direct family groups. This trust that humans have has enabled us to go from conditions like this. This is Somalia, and I picked it for a particular reason, to this, Manhattan. Economists who have looked at trust argue that trust is probably the most important thing that differentiates these societies from this society. The Nobel Prize-winning economist Kenneth Arrow said, virtually every commercial transaction has within itself an element of trust. It is argued that much of the economic backwardness in the world can be explained by the lack of mutual confidence. And two economists, Knack and Zach, have a paper in 2001 and they find a 15 percentage point increase in the proportion of people in a society that trust accounts for a per capita growth of 1% per year difference. In other words, they argue, the difference between Somalia and the United States, which is about $16 trillion of output per year, is largely explained by the lack of trust within those societies. Trust operates in a kind of virtual cycle. Trust allows people to exchange with each other. If I can trust you, I'm willing to do a deal. I will do something for you, you will do something for me. Exchange leads to specialization. Adam Smith, who's on my tie, described specialization in the making of pins. One person making pins can make one pin a day. An assembly line of people who specialize in pin making can make 3,800 pins per day per capita. An enormous increase in productivity through specialization. Think about something we'll talk to you about in a minute, farming. When farming was developed, people could go from having to grow their own food to letting Frank grow food while they did something else. They made clothing or did art or built pottery. That specialization enabled exchange and the creation of wealth in ways that were unimaginable before. Specialization leads to productivity, which leads to wealth. And of course, the more wealth we have, the more stuff we want to do with that wealth, the more exchanges we want to enter into with people, and that leads to a greater demand for trust. The demand for trust, if we could plot it, if we could measure it somehow, how much trust do people want in the society, has been growing exponentially over human history. It's enabled us to do this. Neil Armstrong would never have gone to the moon. Usain Bolt would never have run 9.3 seconds in the 100 meters. Beethoven would never have composed the Ninth Symphony. You pick your human achievement, none of them would have happened without trust and specialization. As Rudyard Kipling said in the Jungle Book, the wolf is the strength of the pack, and the pack is the strength of the wolf. That is, it is individuals who generate human achievements, but it is the collective cooperation of humans which enable those individuals to do their genius. So trust is really important. And if you look at the media and commentators today, they will tell you we're in real trouble. If the difference between Somalia and the United States is trust, we've got a problem because trust is collapsing. Here's just a sample of articles that I pulled up this afternoon when I Googled decline of trust. From The Economist and Forbes and The Atlantic and the Harvard Business Review, people saying trust is collapsing. And we don't need to see these articles. We could look at survey evidence. Here's evidence from the Pew Center. This is trust in government most of the time. So not even like complete trust in government, just most of the time. Do you trust the government? And you can see an enormous decline over the past 60 years. A little bit of a bump here in the end of the Clinton era and the beginning of the George Bush era with 9/11, and then collapse. This decline of trust is true across every category of our society. All of our institutions, the only one where trust has increased since the 1970s is the military. And I think that's partially due to the baseline. The 1970s was a pretty bad period for public trust in the military, given the situation in Vietnam. One solution, of course, I don't mean to frighten you. One solution, of course, to declining trust in government is politics. Elect better people to run the government. This trend is not super sensitive to who's in power. And after all, this is what our politics delivers. A serious problem with political solutions these days is the tribalism of politics. I took this picture of a car in my neighborhood in Hyde Park, and I meant it to illustrate the juxtaposition of these two bumper stickers, the Cubs and Secretary Clinton. Politics for most people today is a team sport. I'm on this team, you're on that team, my team's the good team, your team's the bad team. Brian Kaplan, in his book, The Myth of the Rational Voter, has talked about this. He said, on the margin, voters don't actually determine the policies of the government. None of us are the marginal vote or the median voter who ultimately decide the policies. What we do, and so we don't fully internalize the vote, the cost of our votes. What we do fully internalize is being on one team or the other team. To our friends, to ourselves even, there's 100% value from being a Democrat or a Republican. This means that politics is not going to correlate well with valuable social policies. And of course, there are problems about how government policy gets made. In the public choice literature in economics, this is called the Bootleggers and the Baptists phenomenon. What do these two groups of people, bootleggers and Baptists, I assume these are Baptists, that was Google's top search when I searched Baptists. What do these two groups of people have in common, bootleggers and Baptists? They're both in favor of laws restricting the sale of alcohol. Baptists because they believe it is God's will, and bootleggers because that's their business, selling illegal alcohol. There is an unholy alliance, so to speak, between bootleggers and Baptists. And so politicians will happily take money from bootleggers and pretend to be Baptists. They will push legislation that restricts the sale of alcohol on moral grounds, and maybe actually serving less moral interests. This is kind of a fantastical example. So let me give you a real-world example. This is a vehicle shipping milk. And I mean, maybe Vermont is more dairy country, but this still seems like dairy country to me. You probably in New Hampshire have lots of little mom and pop dairies. And the Environmental Protection Agency had a program based on a rule that they passed called the, I have to actually read it because I could never remember it, the Oil Spill Prevention, Control, and Countermeasure Program, SPCC. The Environmental Protection Agency promulgated a rule requiring dairies to ship milk in containers that were designed to transport oil. This looks like an oil tanker. It looks like someone took a milk sticker and put it on an oil tanker. Why in the world would the government require milk shippers to ship milk in oil tankers? Again, going back to my mom, don't ride with strangers and also don't cry over spilled milk. Who would possibly be in favor of this rule? Well, the answer is big milk. Because industrial milk producers who generate huge amounts of milk can pass on the costs of shipping in very expensive containers much more easily than mom and pop dairy farms. Regulation here serves the interest of businesses, not generally, not capitalism, but of big incumbent businesses. So big incumbent businesses use their power in Washington to go and get the Environmental Protection Agency to promulgate rules which impose costs on their rivals. This was in my Twitter feed this morning, another example. The 8th Circuit Court of Appeals, a federal court in Missouri, upheld a Missouri statute requiring people who practice the passed-down art of African hair braiding to go to 2 different professional schools, 2,500 hours of training to learn how to braid hair because it's in the state interest in public health and safety. This is laughable. It's preposterous. And the only people in favor of this, and I've met some of these women who do this African hair braiding, and they come from Liberia, and their grandmother taught them. There's no chemicals involved. They literally just tie your hair together. The only people in favor of these are people who want to keep these people out of the business, people who have paid for a government monopoly of some kind in the cosmetology business and would like to prevent people from challenging their business. And this will be relevant. You'll see how this connects with what I'm talking about in a minute. Government just keeps getting bigger. Here's the share relative to GDP. And of course, it's not obvious that the government, the justifiable size of government, should be related to GDP. Just to give you an example, the budget that President Trump proposed for 2018 is more than twice as big as the budget that President Clinton proposed in his last term in 2000. Government has doubled in 18 years. And ultimately, and this is my attempt to win over as many of you as possible, I'm fine with the government being this size. Sure, my own politics would be, I would like to see it be smaller. That's not the argument I'm trying to make here today. The argument I'm trying to make here today is about the things the government is doing and isn't doing. And if some of the things in here that the government are doing are inefficient, I want to get the government out of that business. And they could take the money that they're currently spending and spend it on something where the government is really good and efficient at doing it. Okay. So, trust is really important. Trust is collapsing. We really can't rely on politics to solve the problem, at least in the short run. Where is trust today? Because I said I think trust is higher today than at any point in human history. Certainly the amount of trust in society, if we could measure it, is orders of magnitude higher than it was in 1970, even though the data says we don't trust so much anymore. Where is trust? It's in these places. You may know some of these logos, maybe you don't. eBay and Amazon, I think, are pretty familiar. This is Uber, Airbnb. So here, I am buying stuff from strangers in China. I'm never going to buy something from them again. I'm sending money to China. There's no law anywhere to speak of. If I don't get what I paid for, I can't sue somebody in a village in China. I don't even know where they are. Why would I trust them? Airbnb, I'm going to sleep in a stranger's house. Uber, I'm going to ride with a total stranger without the government being involved in regulating it. Feastly, this is one of many new companies. They're called Eat with Strangers apps. Feastly, someone says, I'm hosting a dinner party at my house. You can sign up. It's like matching on Uber. And you can go and have a dinner party at a stranger's house. They will feed you, eating with strangers. GoNanny, a service that my wife and I use a lot in Chicago. It's Uber for kids. I would never trust my kid to ride in a cab. I might trust them to ride in an Uber. GoNanny provides you that extra verification that your kid will be safe riding with us. So these are the companies that I want to talk about and how they are revolutionizing government. Trust is, like I said, I'm a Chicago person, so I think of trust as being provided in a market. Here's a market in Thailand or something closer to home. That's the floor of the now somewhat defunct Chicago Board of Trade. Markets are places where people come together to buy and sell things. Humans have a demand for trust because we want to cooperate with other humans. We can't really provide trust ourselves. I might say, well, I trust you, but one-sided trust without some kind of verification often ends up being destructive. So, institutions, entities, supply trust to individuals. I've given examples already. The government in the taxi cab business. An institution comes and says, we're going to act in a particular way to create trust among a group of humans. There are many different suppliers of trust in the world. And I'm going to talk about those. But for these purposes, trust is just a product that is bought and sold in markets just like everything else. Who do you trust? Who are the suppliers in the market for trust? Well, I mentioned your family. You probably trust your family, although I've known some family members I wouldn't trust so much. Maybe you trust this guy. Your religion, your priest, your rabbi, your imam, maybe you trust them with advice or to provide you with some good or service or to protect you. Maybe you trust this guy. You trust government. Not some abstract entity that we think of as government, but the people we actually elect. Do you trust them to protect you? I've given you some reasons to say yes, the cab example. I've given you reasons to think no, the milk example. Or maybe you trust her. This is Mary Barra. She's the CEO of General Motors. Certainly, every time you get in a car, you are putting your trust in General Motors. That General Motors has behaved in a way that's created conditions in which it's safe to ride in the car. You're going to get out of the car what you expected to get out of the car. And obviously, as that example suggests, these things can work hand in hand. Government and business can work jointly to produce trust, something we'll talk about. What are some features of the market? Well, as I mentioned, there's no self-supply. You can't really supply trust yourself. The market is heavily dependent on technology. An example I'll come back to with cabs. External changes in technology have dramatically altered the market for trust. Uber is impossible without smartphones, without the internet, without cellular technology. And attempts to change the cab business, as we'll talk about in a minute, didn't work when that wasn't true. Trust is a network good, like a fax machine. One person with a fax machine, for those of you who are old enough to remember what a fax machine was, or email. One person with email is worthless. The more people you add to email, the more value it becomes. And the same thing is true for trust. Another really interesting feature of the market for trust is the role of government. In most markets, like the example here of televisions, government is just a regulator of the market. People demand TVs. Sony, Toshiba, they provide TVs. That's the market. And then government is over here regulating that transactions. Make sure through contract law that you get what you're supposed to get when you sign a contract. Regulating through tort law or products liability law that the TV doesn't blow up and kill you. Government plays an important role through antitrust law, making sure Sony and Toshiba don't join together and eliminate all the other providers and then jack the prices up to earn more of the surplus. Lots of things government does to make sure this market functions well. And I don't want to belittle those in my remarks. What's interesting about the market for trust is government is both a regulator of the market for trust and also a competitor in the market for trust. People demand dispute resolution services. I sent payment to someone, they didn't send me back what I was supposed to get. Government says, we'll provide contract law with a threat of violence from the state that if you don't get what you're supposed to get, we will enforce those terms against the other party and therefore increase your willingness to trust that person. But other people provide those services. eBay, for instance. In my earlier example, I happily send money to people in China based on eBay's 5-star rating system. And if I have a dispute, if the person doesn't send me the good, eBay has an internal, private, non-governmental mechanism for resolving that. So eBay is, in a sense, competing with the government to provide trust. Government could provide trust I send money to someone in China to send me back a Sidney Crosby Pittsburgh Penguins jersey, which is something I've done. How could government do that? It could establish transnational courts. The United States could sign an agreement with China that exposed people in China to US law. It could sign an international agreement. It could do a variety of things to expand the scope of government, but eBay says, look, you don't need to do that. We'll do it. We can provide the level of trust necessary for these transactions to happen without involving more government. And the number of transactions is staggering. On Black Thursday last year, eBay processed over 10,000 transactions per second. Government was nary in sight. The danger here, of course, when government is here and here, I think this is my last picture of Trump, so maybe I should have given a trigger warning before I started. The danger here is a kind of conflict of interest. Government will see eBay as a rival taking its business and then regulate eBay to make it less efficient, to knock out a competitor. We saw this in the example of milk already, and we'll come back to this in the example of Uber now. Is it surprising that governments around the world, some even in the United States, like Austin, Texas, have tried to kill Uber? Not surprising at all, because Uber is a competitor not to cabs. Uber doesn't own any taxi cabs. They don't employ any drivers. Uber is merely in the trust business. There are people who want rides, and there are people with cars who are willing to give people rides. And Uber says, we'll match these people. You want a ride? I'll get you a ride over here. That guy will give you a ride. Okay, you two get together and do the magic of capitalism. They're in the business of creating sufficient trust through 5-star rating systems and dispute resolution systems that create enough trust for me to get in a total stranger's car. And their rival in that business is the Taxi Cab Commission of Chicago, who has another approach, which is yellow cars and regulation and so forth. And so it's not at all surprising that governments say, you know what, we don't really like you guys in the trust business. That's our business. And when I say our, I don't mean the citizens of London. I mean the people who run the taxi regulation and the people who benefit from the status quo, and that is the people who currently hold the monopoly on government power. Okay, so here is a sort of typology of trust that tries to set out what I've been talking about. 3 big types, 3 big providers of trust: government, businesses, and individuals. The most easy one to start with is the personal one. This is where we all start. This is tribe, your cave-dwelling ancestors, your family, interpersonal trust. And of course, interpersonal trust is the best kind of trust because there's no one standing between you and the other person in the transaction. All of us, our most natural form of trust is interpersonal trust. But the problem with interpersonal trust is you have to have a personal relationship. And that's really hard to scale, as economists say. I might have 20 friends. To make another 20 friends, to expand my opportunities for human cooperation, would be an enormous investment on my part. The typical organization functions at about 100 people before you need a giant bureaucracy. When I was at McKinsey, they said the optimal office size for McKinsey without too much bureaucracy is 100 people. And there's a guy who has done research in this. It's called Dunbar's number. About 150 people is the maximum size for an individual-based human community. But 150 people, you can't cooperate very much. Government can be an intermediary. It can provide trust in the way I suggested, but it's got this problem that government can be distorted by special interest groups. People like Trump can be in charge of the government, or even worse, someone like Chavez or Maduro in Venezuela. And the governments can misuse the faith we put in it to create trust for bad ends. Businesses too can create trust. I gave the example of General Motors. General Motors can provide us lots of trust, but they too can act in bad ways. They can do the Ford Pinto or sell us dangerous cigarettes, as someone brought up in a Q&A earlier this afternoon. Businesses are profit-seeking, and they can skimp and cheat, and they can disappoint us too. The real exciting thing about technology, and I should say at this point, I'm not a technology person. When I went to law school, I didn't have an email address. I'm not in love with technology. I'm not like a gadget head. So this is not a natural thing for me to be proselytizing about. The exciting thing about these platforms, the eBays and the Ubers and the Feastleys and the Airbnbs of the world, is that they have figured out a way using technology to scale personal trust, to expand our ability to rely on other individuals without intermediaries like the government or businesses. I'll go back and talk about some of these other characteristics as we go. Okay, so I've talked a little bit about human history, and it bears repeating or it bears going over in a little bit more detail. My co-author and I have divided human society into 4 periods: hunter-gatherer, agriculture, industrial, and information. The 4 big revolutions of humanity. And trust has been provided in different ways in all of these periods. Originally, in our hunter-gatherer period, the trust innovation is the tribe, at the tribal level, and examples of trust are biological, like I said, family, and also language, something I'll return to in a minute, which is a trust technology. As agriculture comes along, we need to cooperate vastly bigger scales. And when you have to rely on a lot more strangers, you need law. And we'll see the original human societies, like the Babylonians, innovated in law to create trust. Also, we see the rise of guilds, a sort of private law. The first example of real private business provided law during this period. When the industrial age comes along, we start communicating and dealing with strangers at even bigger scales, and the complexity and risk gets even bigger. We need a new trust delivery tool, and the progressive movement and then the New Dealers give us that with the rise of the regulatory state. That takes us a long way, but it can't get us all the way. And so by the 1950s, you see companies creating new trust delivery tools. Here I'm talking about brand specifically, and I'll come back to that. And then finally, in the information age, we get the rise of what I call the digital tribe. Here's just an example of the growth of human cooperation. The typical tribe, less than 50 people, and here's the Dunbar's number that I was talking about, 150. It took us from caveman age all the way to 8,000 BC, so a period of 20,000 some years, 30,000 years. The biggest human communities are 500 people. When agriculture kicks in, the growth of human societies expands unbelievably. And by the Roman period, we've got a society of 1 million people living together. This goes along from Rome in 1 AD to London in the 1800s without much expansion. And then when the industrial age comes and we have new trust technologies, we get to the point where we have cities like Tokyo with 30 million people, or New York. Trust embedded in society in ways that are staggering to our ancestors. Okay, I mentioned language as an example of a trust delivery tool. Here's a bunch of ways to say hello in various languages. Language was an early trust innovation because when I go to Norway and I try to speak Norwegian, I know a little bit, they instantly know I'm not Norwegian. The easiest way to signal in-group or out-group status is language. Knowing the nuances of a language, as my 7-year-old daughter asked me, what does the word CIT spell? And I said, there is no word CIT. There's a cat, there's a cot, there's a cut, there's no sit. Why is that? Why would we have words like eleemosynary and not sit? Well, one of the reasons that's been argued for the complexity of language is complex languages are a way of investing in a group, a tribe. It means something to speak English, and all else being equal, I trust English speakers more than I trust people who speak a foreign language. There's some research on this. In a study of 300 Finnish and Chinese subsidiaries, Barner, Rasmussen, and Bjorkman show language fluency is essential to developing inter-unit trust. People within the same company who speak different languages operating in English have less trust in each other when they speak different languages. This is just remnants from our tribal eras. Writing. Here's a Mesopotamian clay tablet. And the first writing and record keeping here is about wheat or barley. This is grain, and these are plots of land, and these are some numbers about those investments. Why was writing necessary? Well, if I'm going to have as my job growing grain for you, I need to trust that my long-term investment in this plot of land and these seeds I'm plotting will be realized. No one's going to come and steal it from me. No one's going to try to cheat me. So these records need to be kept. And if these records are kept, then I can trust that you will do your job, we can specialize, we can cooperate. So writing and record keeping become a hugely important innovation in the early periods. And of course, the first agricultural societies, the big move they make to create human cooperation is law. This is the Code of Hammurabi, and here are just two examples. I leave my stuff with you, my sheep, my cattle, you don't do your job, you pay me 10 times the loss. And standing in the back of this is the next provision, which is, I, King Hammurabi, will kill you. That is a very strong motivator of trust. You can trust because we've laid it down in law under threat of violence, something the state still uses to this day. And thank goodness, it has enabled us to have an incredibly flourishing society. But of course, there's a huge cost of law, of holding people to account for these provisions. There may be mistakes that are made. The people in charge of the law may, in their prosecutorial discretion, target particular individuals, just like big businesses or the government can misuse the trust power in regulation, so too can it in violence. We have in this country hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people, 2.5 million or something, behind bars. Why? Because it's necessary, the government tells us, for citizens to be able to trust that they won't be cheated in a transaction, trust that they'll be safe in their homes, trust that they won't be accosted on the sidewalk. Whatever the explanation is, we're taking away people's liberty to create trust. And, like the milk example, we have put our faith in the government to do this for us, but we really don't have a great way of holding them account when they go too far. Here's the incarceration rate, the highest by far of any country, developed country, and look at the crime rate. If you were here, and I remember the kind of this period, New York City was a crime-ridden, horrible place, you could justify. I saw Nelson Rockefeller's bio out there and how he really toughened New York drug laws. Well, no wonder. New York was a mess in the 1970s. But then what explains the fact that it seems like there's been an effect of this increase, and here comes the crime rate, and this thing takes off like crazy? Is it the influence of the sort of prison industrial complex? Is it that people don't pay attention really to politics? I'm a Republican. I'm tough on crime. I've coded that in my brain. I'm voting for the tough on crime party. Or I'm a Republican and what I really care about is lower taxes, but for whatever reason to get elected, Republicans have combined lower taxes with tough on crime, and so I don't really care about these people. Those are other people, and I'm willing to let them all rot in jail. It's not just people in jail. Here's Eric Garner, killed, murdered by a bunch of cops because he was selling illegal cigarettes. The violence the state uses has a real cost. Necessary to create agriculture and cooperation, a huge cost. Around the time of the 12th, 13th, 14th centuries, society starts expanding beyond small nation states, and there's more and more trade. And the power of the state to project violence is limited by the technology of the day. The kings and queens and princes of Europe could not control transactions that were happening thousands of miles away. Does anybody know where this is? This is Bergen in Norway. Bergen in Norway became very important because there was fish in the Lofoten Islands in the very far north of Norway, and a pope in Europe said, you should eat fish on Fridays. Huge demand for fish. People need to get fish from the Lofoten Islands down to mainland continental Europe. How can they do it? There's no one government that had power to enforce contracts over those great distances, like me buying something from someone in China. So what did the people of the day do? Well, they created this thing called the Hanseatic League, based in Lübeck in Germany with outposts all over, including London and Bergen. And they created their own system of private law. They were like shadow governments. They created dispute resolution system among the various traders here bringing fish from the Lofoten Islands to Europe. They were governments without borders. They were private law. And they didn't do it because they were displacing government law. They were doing it because there was no government law. They needed to create a trust mechanism that the people fishing could trust the buyers in continental Europe, and they had to create their own mechanism of trust creation. This is a painting of a fair in England in the 15th century, and they had courts called pie powder courts. My French is bad, so pie here is for foot, P-A, and poudre is dust, dusty feet. They were dusty feet courts because they took place outside. These were merchants buying and selling, and the king could not, because these were taking place in the remote parts of England, could not have the legal infrastructure to police these transactions. And so the merchant said, well, no one will come to our fair unless they can trust they won't be cheated. And the king is unable to provide that trust. We'll create the trust our own way by creating our own court system. This idea, from Bergen to fairs in England and the law merchant, comes to the United States in 1792, when, apocryphally, some people meet here under a buttonwood tree on the corner of Wall and Broad Streets, and they say, we are going to create a court system to regulate stockbrokers. Mythology says it's not correct, that this became the New York Stock Exchange. The New York Stock Exchange was formed later in 1817, but the idea is the same, and mythology is powerful. What happened in 1792? Well, New York State passed a law called the Stock Jobbing Act. I think it was anti-Semitic, but that's just speculation on my part. They were trying to stop brokers. They said they didn't like the idea that brokers were just middlemen. They weren't really building anything or producing anything. They just stood between two people who were doing something, like Uber, like eBay. The law said, if you have a contract for the sale of a financial instrument, like at that time government debt, it's not enforceable in New York courts. Meaning if you were cheated, it would be like hiring a hitman. and the hitman doesn't do the hit, and you want to take him to court, you say, I paid you $10,000 to kill my rival, and you didn't do it, please give me my $10,000 back. No court in the United States will give you your $10,000 back. So that's what the New York legislature did about brokerage contracts. This would put brokers out of business. Nobody could trust a hitman or a broker unless these contracts could be enforced by the government. And if you don't trust them, brokers will be out of business. So what did the brokers do? They said, just like the people in Bergen, we are going to create our own law. They created the New York Stock Exchange, a private, as William O. Douglas, then SEC Commissioner and future Supreme Court Justice, said, the New York Stock Exchange is a private club with elements of a casino. It's a private club that says you pay membership to join. If you cheat somebody, we will throw you out. And you will lose your bond, the money you paid to get into the New York Stock Exchange. That is your deposit against cheating. The New York Supreme Court blessed this in a case called Hatch versus Belton in 1833. And from 1817 until 1933, we had private regulation of stockbrokers and no federal regulation. And even after 1933, the New Dealers kept private regulation, and it exists today, something called FINRA. The primary regulation of stockbrokers is a private company, like the Fishermen of Bergen, like the Pie Powder Courts. They created law that would be a substitute for government law. Early corporations were the same. One of the first corporations was called the Company of Merchants of the Staple. Its royal charter was in 1319. Who were these guys? They were British merchants operating in Antwerp and Leuven in Belgium. The British king was fighting the French, and the Belgians were on the side, and Flanders were on the side of the French, but they really needed the British wool. So the Flanders prince said, well, we don't really want to help you, and we're not going to adjudicate your disputes. And the British king, being in England, and this being 1319, can't exert his monopoly on violence in Belgium. He can't haul cheating people into courts. They're in Belgium. He might not even know about it for years. So what did the British merchants do? They said, no one will trust us if we don't have a disciplining system to prevent cheaters. The Flanders people won't do it. The British people can't do it. We have to create something ourselves. They created a company, a corporation. They appointed a board of directors who acted more like judges. And if wool merchants cheated, they punished them and they kicked them out, just like the stock exchange some 500, 400 years later. As society got more complicated, law had to advance. Upton Sinclair's The Jungle showed the dangers of modern industrial processes. People were now consuming products that were made by strangers miles, thousands of miles away. And the American legal innovation to address this was the idea of administrative agencies and the regulatory state. Here's FDR and all these bottles with their alphabet agencies are new expert agencies designed to bring additional trust to American consumers. We will regulate the safety of the medicines and the foods that you eat. We will regulate working conditions. We will regulate securities transactions, airplanes. A whole host of things are added from the 1930s through the high water mark is the Nixon administration in the 1970s. President Carter doesn't get enough credit for his initial steps at rolling back some of the regulatory overreach in the late 1970s. My libertarian colleague, Richard Epstein, laments the rise of the New Deal. He thinks the New Deal, this trust innovation, was a mistake. And when I was his student, I tended to agree with him. I saw the growth of government that I described earlier. I saw the government excesses of today, and I looked back and thought, yeah, maybe the New Deal was a mistake. When I started this project, that was my view. And now I don't think that. Government at the time was the best mechanism for delivering the trust that we all needed to be able to cooperate on unimaginable scales to people in the pre-industrial period. But over time, the regulatory state starts to have a diminishing effect. The problems of regulatory capture, like the milk example, become costs that may swamp the benefits of additional regulatory action. Political fights become nastier as regulatory scope expands. In the 1950s, after 15 or so years of New Deal action, we see the rise of brands in ways. There had been brands back in Roman times even, but never on a scale like happened in America in the 1950s. Dunkin' Donuts is one of the first. I know that's beloved here in New Hampshire, 1950. Holiday Inn is 1952. Denny's, 1953. H&R Block, 1955. McDonald's, 1956. A bursting of brands. And how are brands related to trust? Well, think about driving cross-country in the 1940s and 1950s. Will you trust that that hamburger you're going to eat is what you paid for, that it won't poison you? We could have a system of government regulation where government went into mom and pop diners along Route 66, tested hamburgers, maybe they even rated hamburgers like they do securities. And they said, they had government tasters who came in and said, yeah, the products are similar across and they're safe and you won't be poisoned. We could imagine that kind of government. But government growing to that kind of scale brings with it a bunch of costs. And McDonald's and Denny's, they said, no, we got a better solution. We will spend huge amounts of money advertising, which will serve as a kind of bond, like the bond the brokers paid to get into the stock exchange. And every time someone eats a hamburger, we're betting that brand, the billions we've spent on advertising, that that person won't be poisoned. We will build up trust through your ability to rely on our identifiable brand. Brand became a substitute for government. It doesn't undoing anything government was already doing. It just provided additional layer on top of government trust. And then, of course, the digital tribe. The digital tribe, this is Facebook's visualization of the personal connections of people on Facebook. People, and this should make everybody exhilarated. I know when I was a law student, people talked about world government. Here, people are connecting with each other all over the planet in ways that the world government could never achieve. And the information generated by this, about 5 libraries of Congress are added to the digital database every day. That huge amount of data and information can potentially be harnessed to create the kind of scaled interpersonal trust I talked about. So, small version and scaled version, the 3 types of trust. Tribe becomes the digital tribe. Guild morphs into brand. Global brands now can operate at scales unimaginable. And the rule of law at its largest scale is the regulatory state. Okay. Over at the Tuck Business School, they talk about the life cycle of a typical business, how they grow, mature. Eventually, it gets so big that the gains from adding an additional unit to a business are offset by the costs, and businesses get smaller. We could do the same plot over time that I just did with trust. Our green line is personal trust, which starts out as the tribe. This is sort of the amount of trust being provided. When we enter the agricultural age, tribal trust is not enough. We need agriculture. We need the rule of law. And so the rule of law kicks in. It's working pretty well, but then it starts to kind of fall off. Business trust, which doesn't exist, starts to become very important. This is my example of the pie powder courts and the Bergen Hanseatic League. So business trust now is sort of the leader of the various types of trust, but they're all additive to each other. It's not like we stopped trusting our families when guilds came along or the rule of law. As business becomes more complex in the industrial age, we need the rise of the regulatory state. We can't have modern society without it. Then brand comes along, becomes more important, and I think finally, as we enter the informational age, this possibly, this is speculation on my part, this idea of the digital tribe and personal trust becoming even more and more important. The key part of this, though, is, and this is speculation, personal trust scaled by the digital tribe doesn't follow this natural curve because there's no intermediary. As it scales, it doesn't add in the potential costs of bureaucracy, of regulatory capture, of business profit motives, cutting back its effectiveness. One of my favorite examples, and then I'll wrap up pretty soon and take questions, of my thesis is ticket scalping. When I went to New York as a kid to watch what was then the Big East basketball tournament, we inevitably, my team, Pitt Panthers, always lost. And we wanted to sell our tickets to the finals so that we could afford a dinner at Smith & Wollensky's. But ticket scalping was illegal in New York. So there was a supply and a demand for tickets, and we had to go into the shadows, and we were worried we were going to be arrested. We were worried we were going to be arrested for moving an asset to its highest valued use. Here's a sign at a stadium: beware of ticket scalpers. Why would ticket scalping be illegal? Where I went to law school, mission number one of law: move assets to higher valued users. Why would you make this illegal? Well, for a simple reason. Why would you throw people in jail like these poor unfortunate souls who went to jail for ticket scalping? Or Eric Garner. He was arrested for selling illegal cigarettes. They might have just as well killed him for ticket scalping, something as trivial. Why would we do this? Well, from the standpoint of the business, the person who sold the tickets, the Cubs, the Red Sox, they put up this sign because they're worried that people will defraud you. You can't trust that the tickets you get will be legitimate. And if you buy fake tickets for $300 to go to see the Red Sox play the Yankees, and you show up at the stadium and the ticket taker says, "I'm sorry, these are fake tickets," you might not be, like, the person who sold them to you, gone. And you might be mad at the Red Sox. So we get legislation that says you can't trust resales, we'll ban them. And not only will we ban them, we will use the violence of the state, deprive you of your freedom, maybe kill you, to make sure that you can trust the tickets you buy will allow you to get into the game you want to. And then, magically, all this goes away. Because some boffins in Silicon Valley use technology to invent something called StubHub, where the ability to transfer tickets in a completely verifiable way is instantaneous. I have season tickets to the Bears. I went to one game this year because my son's got all sorts of things and life intervenes. What did I do with all the other tickets? I'd email a friend. I'd say, "Do you want to go to the game?" He or she would say yes. I would email them the tickets. They had them immediately on their phone, verifiable on their phone. They'd click to go in. No problem. And of course, everybody benefits from this. So here's an example of the government stopping transactions because of a concern about creating trust, using all its tools, including violence, and then that all going away because a better mousetrap comes along. I should mention, briefly, taxis were deregulated in the 1980s. When Thatcher and Reagan take over and President Carter started deregulating airlines and trucking in 1978, a bunch of cities, I have it here somewhere, it doesn't really matter, 30-something cities deregulated their cab businesses. They deregulated their cab businesses because we know the problems of cabs. Too few of them, monopolies, generating monopoly profits, there's not enough cabs in locations. If you're like I am and you live in a heavily African-American part of the United States, you can't get cabs. It's been that way in Chicago forever. You could get illegal jitney services, but I didn't know who those people were, and I wasn't going to ride with an illegal rider. So the problems of cabs were well known. The Reaganites deregulated, in all these cities and towns, deregulated their cabs. And then the conclusion after 10 or 15 years of experiments was the deregulation didn't work. And all the cities that deregulated, re-regulated, because there was no technology that enabled trust to be created in the way that Uber has enabled. I could talk more about that, but I'm running short on time. I should note that Uber's great innovation, which is using a 5-star rating system, being able to get instant refunds, being able to track yourself on GPS, is actually more regulation than that provided by government. You rate Uber, Uber rates you, which encourages good behavior on both buyers and sellers. We would never tolerate the government rating us in the same way. I have a bad experience in Uber, I give 1 star, Uber immediately gives me my money back. That kind of experience is actually more regulation than what the government can give us. And I think as life gets more complicated and we become wealthier and demand more safety, we're all going to demand more regulation. The question is, who's going to provide that for us? The government solution to a taxi problem, this was last year in Las Vegas, and the guy who, this example was one of the founders of Firefox, where I downloaded these pictures from. People would long haul people from McCarran Airport to the Strip. Instead of going the short way, they'd take the long way, they'd get $5 extra. If you're just a visitor to Las Vegas once, you don't know, you don't care, it's not worth complaining. They're just stealing $5 from you. The government and Uber solution, they track you on GPS. If an Uber driver long hauls you, they immediately give you your money back. Problem solved. How did the government approach this problem? First, they put up roadblocks. They stopped you from where you were going to make sure that you weren't being long hauled. Thank you very much. When people complained, government put up signs like this one in McCarran Airport's baggage terminal in, it looks like, 1-point font, telling you where your destination was and how much it should be costing you. 0 people read this sign, so they went to Plan C, which is posting an Excel spreadsheet on the Taxi Commission's website detailing which cab numbers had been cited, so that if you were very vigorous about keeping your $5, you could go on before your trip, look at the website, say, I'm in line, but that's, oh my goodness, $22,699, I'm not riding with that guy, and then get in a fight with a taxi dispatcher who says, just get in the cab because there's a line of people. Okay, that didn't work either. So their final solution was, here's what we'll do. We'll have people go onto our website, download a PDF document that details when they were long hauled. This document has to be notarized. So just bring your attorney and your notary in your carry-on luggage and all to get back $5. Okay, so we can see here, this system, way better than the government-imposed system. Doesn't mean that all government is inefficient compared to the Uber example. I want to save time for questions, so I'm going to stop. I could talk more, but I'll stop here. My ultimate conclusion is the history of trust has demonstrated that there is competition. We want it. We demand it. And trust and regulation go hand in hand. And the question is, for us going forward, who's going to provide the additional trust that we need in our complex society? My fear, as the Uber example demonstrates, is that government is not going to go gently into that good night. It's going to resist giving away the power it has so jealously guarded, and the people who wield government power are going to selfishly protect it because it's in their interest to protect it. We got rid of people in toll booths because there was a much better way to do it. Even though toll takers were a powerful interest group and were able to resist it for a long time, E-ZPass is way more efficient. There are businesses out there who are creating trust that can bring the same efficiencies to government, and we just need to let them do it. Okay, I'll take your questions. You should, I got more applause at the beginning. Please wait for the microphone before starting your question so we can hear you. There's someone right, yeah, perfect.
Thanks a lot. That was interesting. I don't disagree in many ways with the history you told. I would describe those as institutional mechanisms of trust, law, business, all those different, including some of the technology. The concern I have is at the very end with there is no limit to this kind of technology. So
Yeah.
I just want to give two examples. So one is the evidence of discriminatory behavior on Airbnb, for example. And it hasn't been shown to my knowledge yet on Uber, but I'm sure it's there too. And so what is the recourse for... What I want to dispute is that this is somehow a perfect instrument of trust, or better, they all have limits and they all have pros under different conditions. So that's really the concern or question I have. I want to hear you. And so I think discrimination on the new platforms, and so what's the recourse for that as an example. And the second is the, for some reason, I end up with a rating of 1 star on my Uber. There's a great Portlandia episode about rating. Others, if anybody wants to ever look at that.
Also a
about
Black Mirror episode of the same. That's
somebody,
great.
yeah, well, those are scarier. Portlandia's funny. But that I then may not be able to get access to a good. And maybe some of that is actually a good thing. Maybe I would change my behavior, but I sometimes need a ride from the airport into the city. And so what happens when, and that's discrimination in a different way.
Yep.
It's not the sort of Airbnb, people of color have lower ratings, all, with no evidence of reason for that other than discrimination.
Oh, those are both excellent questions, so thank you. Okay, so for the first one, you are 100% right that I need to avoid, we all need to avoid, what economists call the nirvana fallacy. That is, comparing one alternative to some kind of nirvana. Is this system, the interpersonal trust in the digital tribe, perfect? Of course not. It's run by human beings. We're not perfect. So I'm only in the business, insofar as I'm making this argument, and we've got to do it on a one-to-one comparison, and for each additional move. So it's not like we should just get rid of all government and replace it with this. We have to compare the costs and benefits of both. Who's the most efficient provider of a particular trust activity? And we want to compare it to the next best alternative, not to like nirvana. Okay, so I'm against discrimination of all kinds. I don't think any system eliminates it perfectly. Let me give you an example. In 1971, Ed Kitch, who was a law professor at the University of Chicago, wrote an article in the Journal of Law and Economics about taxi cab regulation in Chicago. At that point, economists were pretty clear that the deadweight losses from government regulation were significant, and the puzzle was why we still had taxi cab regulation. What was really puzzling was, and if you don't know Chicago, you got the lake over here. This is the business district. This part of Chicago is white. This part of Chicago is black. Cabs were required by law to pick people up everywhere in the city of Chicago without any discrimination. A must-carry rule that was coupled with charge average prices. Those two things are actually a genius solution to a very strange market, the taxi market, where you don't really compete because you're just standing there and someone pulls up to you. Okay, there's a bunch of economic literature about this. Although legally compelled to come here, no cabs ever came here. And pre-Uber, when I was living right here, you could not get a cab to come to my house. This was the cab system. So I'm comparing it to this. Now, what Uber has actually done, Ubers are as ubiquitous in this part of town as this part of town. It has solved a massive discrimination against African American people that existed under government regulation. Okay? Now, what's going on in Airbnb, I don't know. We'd want to look at that scenario. We don't flesh that out in our book. We use the Uber example. I'd want to look at that. If Airbnb is engaging in discrimination or encouraging it in some way, that's something the government might want to look at. And of course, some types of racial discrimination, depending on who you are still forbidden. I should note a kind of peculiarity here. We don't really have the courage of our convictions when it comes to racial discrimination, because although as a business I'm forbidden from engaging in racial discrimination if I'm a landlord. As a tenant, I'm not forbidden. I'm choosing roommates. I can be as racist as I want in the choosing of roommates or who I date. So you could imagine if I go on to Match or JDate and I never click on a black face or an Indian face or an Asian face, they're not going to be liable for that. And we could imagine a government that says, you know what, where we can show private racism like this, we're going to also stamp that out. I don't think a lot of us want to go there, but maybe we would. But that may be something that's not solvable in either of these systems. So I'm against discrimination. I'm in favor of the government regulating these providers. I said government might favor itself. I'm okay with government regulating these platform providers where they're violating law. Yeah, okay.
You had one word in your title, which you haven't referred to yet, which is hacking.
Yeah. You picked up on that. I was getting to that.
Okay. Yeah.
So let me tell you what that is. So what Uber did that was interesting, remember I said that brand added trust on top of what the government was doing? Uber did something really fundamentally interesting, which is government was already providing the trust in the cab market. And Uber said, we've got a better way to do this. And so they didn't expand trust. They went back and they undid what they thought was an inefficient government system. And the way they hacked it, here hack is not like a hacksaw. Hack is a kind of solution to a problem. Computer programmers can hack something. They figure out a way to do it better. What they did that was really interesting was they basically flouted the law. They went into Chicago and they said, we don't care that it's illegal. We're going, because we're never going to convince the taxi commission to let us operate on terms that will be welfare enhancing. And the cab medallions in Chicago were worth $2.5 billion before Uber came in. And now they're almost worthless. Not worthless, but fraction of that. Notwithstanding the losses to these cab drivers, and I would feel bad for them if they weren't owned by giant corporations who were able to diversify their risk, if they were actually individual owners, but they're not, so I don't. The social welfare gains from Uber, and we talk about this in the books, absolutely dwarf this. The ability to solve the racial discrimination problem, the ability of individual owners of capital to not have to rely on a cab company, but to set their own terms and earn money on the side. The reductions in crime, in drunk driving deaths, all these things are huge. How did Uber accomplish this? Well, they went directly to the people. They said they used their riders as a kind of lobbying tool. Embedded in every price of every Uber ride was a kind of donation to their strategy to roll back regulation. And they mobilized their customers. So I was an early Uber customer because I couldn't get cabs in my neighborhood. When Illinois was threatening to regulate them out of business, they sent messages to all their customers. And they said, mobilize. And here's the way you do it. Just press this button. And I pressed the button, and millions of other people pressed the button, and Illinois got the message. Remember, government is this thing where you vote for your tribe, it goes into this thing called government, and no voter in the history of Chicago has ever voted for mayor or city council based on taxi rules. And knowing this, the taxi commission can get away with murder because they know they're not sensitive to the political winds. And Uber went around this system by mobilizing voters directly. That's the kind of regulatory hack they engaged in. And they've effectively rolled this strategy on the United States. They have not been as effective in foreign countries. I don't know why London has been less effective. I know there are, to get back to the racial discrimination angle, undertones of that in that situation. Uber drivers tend to be young, male, Pakistani, Indian immigrants. cab drivers in England, because they have to pass these ridiculous tests, are all old white guys. And so there probably is some of that in the politics. And the hack here is, let's get around that by mobilizing consumers directly.
Let me
Yeah.
ask the question.
Yes, please.
Hacking has two meanings in
Okay.
computing. And your example now reminds me of a third. Uber was playing with the business of hacking.
That's correct. Also true. They are called hacks.
Yes. Anyway, hacking, meaning breaking into computers,
Yes.
is an interesting example of the systems that are being sold are an interesting example of a product that has been completely insulated from the uniform commercial code. There's no responsibility for fitness for use. And is there any out to this in the computing business?
This is a great question, and my suggestion is that you address it to someone who actually knows what they're talking about, because I have no idea. I don't know anything about cyber law or the issues. It's a very good question. It's just not my thing at all, and so I wouldn't even venture a guess.
Where do we fit, do you think, at this point with, as you're using the Uber example, to autonomous driving vehicles and their future?
Yeah, it's great. So think about the change in trust that driverless cars will bring us. We have armed patrols of government agents swarming our streets, enforcing traffic laws. And in the last few years, it gives me chills to think of the number of, especially African American people, who've been killed in traffic stops, and cops killed in traffic stops, and high-speed chases. The reason we have armed patrols of people, of government agents on the streets, is so that you and I can trust that when we get out on the road, we're not going to be killed. That people are going to drive within the bounds of the speed limit, that people are not going to be drunk. I can trust to drive on Lakeshore Drive or tomorrow to Manchester because the government is enforcing traffic laws. But there's a cost, like the prison, like the milk. Whenever you give the government power, they might misuse that power. And they can misuse that power in the ways I've just described. With autonomous computer-driven cars, you don't need armed bands of people. Regulation is much easier to achieve. You can, if the government wants to stop people from speeding above a certain amount, they can just command them to go that speed. The possibility of preventing anybody who's drinking from getting into a car. You're driving, it doesn't matter if you're drunk. So we can radically change. We don't need courts adjudicating traffic disputes. So we could radically reduce the amount of government regulation on the roads that would be necessary if computers are driving cars. And that's a big welfare gain. We need to redirect those government resources from traffic cops to something else. All right? Take that money and give people health insurance, educate kids, whatever it is you want to do with it. So that's a great example of how an exogenous outside technology shock can really shake what the kind of trust the government needs to be providing.
I'd like to ask you about your thoughts on the negative side of technology, the fake news, the alternative facts, the truthiness issue. That as you went through your history of where trust is derived from, we all saw examples of human organizations, families, governments, businesses, groups of people who we derived trust from or we lost trust to. But technology isn't necessarily a human thing. It's a machine, and it can be a source of alternative facts, of alternative understandings, which actually works against trust. So do you have thoughts about how technology could undermine our trust of what is real, what is reality, what is truth?
Don't ask me big questions, please. I put the Pope on my slides, but I'm not the Pope, so I'm not going to get at what is reality or what is truth. Okay, I have a couple of reactions. The first one is a friendly amendment, if you will. I'm not up here in favor of technology. I'm up here arguing that interpersonal trust can be scaled with technology. So the trust that I'm relying on is not necessarily a machine. It's all of us who are enabled to work together, to cooperate. That's laws about solving collective action problems and getting humans to cooperate. Okay. Where technology can help us do that, we should do it. Where it doesn't, for maybe the reasons you suggested, we shouldn't do it. Okay, so I'm open to that being a problem or a cost. Okay, another reaction is, and something I didn't get to, the future of this a possibility. So, where can technology provide obvious gains? Take something like blockchain or the distributed ledger. Right now, if you buy a house in Chicago, you have to pay someone to go to, the government has a property records office and they've got bureaucrats there who are filing papers to make sure that you can trust when you buy a piece of real estate, it's actually owned by the person selling it to you, et cetera, et cetera. You pay a lawyer, there's a escrow, property title insurance company. We don't need any of that. Get it all, get rid of it. Property ownership can be stored in the distributed ledger. It's not hackable, it's verifiable, and it's dispersed among everybody, all computer systems. Okay, so that's an easy example, maybe. But let me give a more controversial one, where I was going to go. Judges. Let's take judges making determinations about who gets bail or not. So you commit a crime, you're put in jail, you're pending a trial, and the judge has to decide, should you get out or not? Judges are humans. They get information inputted to them and they make a decision. We can't observe their decision making. And so the human might be biased. There is studies, there's a whole bunch of them that I found myself wading into for this book, saying that people are biased against blacks. There's studies going the other way. There's a whole mass of empirical data about all the biases that human judges might have. So my colleague Jens Ludwig in Chicago, who runs our crime lab, and a bunch of co-authors did an experiment. They put bail decisions in the hands of an artificial intelligence. They fed it all the same information that the judges would have got. And they had a very nice experimental design. You can read the paper if you're interested. Their upshot was, we could reduce the number of people held in jail on bail by 25% without changing the crime rate at all. So an example of how computers, in this example, could do way better than judges. We build this judicial system and we put it in temples with big stone things so it looks really, we can have confidence in it. We're getting less and less confident with judges. So again, I'm just comparing the idea of computer judges, and people are now in contract areas writing contracts that can be enforced by computers. They're already doing this. I might trust alternative mechanisms for dispute resolution more than I would judges. Originally in the criminal law, in Roman times, there was no government. It was a system of private violence. You killed my slave, I would come and kill one of your slaves. The private system of violence was unstable because people got blood feuds and they would go too far and it was cycles of violence. Government stepped in and said, we're going to have a monopoly on violence because we can create better trust in our society. We're coming to the point, and that was this slide here, where maybe taking out the human judges might be an improvement. But I'm not yet convinced of that, and I'm very sensitive to your concerns, so it's something we're going to have to proceed with. I just want, my only point now is we should have those debates and those investigations on the merits of the costs and benefits of the two approaches, and be careful because the government is going to be leery about giving up this power. Maybe one more question?
This goes further in the whole hacking issue, which I'm, of course, referring to the interference by, presumably by Russia, with the huge amounts of fake news deliberately, and this fits Russia's foreign policy to eliminate trust, not only with us, but their interference in Poland, Germany,
Yep.
France, and so forth. And there are supporters in each of those countries who are going to be sympathetic to these to the things that are falsely accused here. Would this entail a combination of government and private activities? And it is an international issue here. I just don't want to limit it to the U.S. Maybe it's too big a question, but it's a real one here.
Yeah. So every technology, every system of organizing society has potential problems. And our adversaries, or people within the society, right, the Constitution talks about enemies foreign and domestic, can misuse the technologies of trust to their own bad ends. The growth of the prison population, let's say that's attributable to the prison industrial complex, private prisons, et cetera. Right. The egos of prosecutors, the venal instincts of voters who just say, yeah, lock them up, really don't think about it. Okay, that's not so much different because we've created this trust delivery mechanism and people are abusing it. The scalping example, litany of examples where, take guilds for example. When those brokers met under that tree, what was the first thing they did? They didn't create the system of discipline. They fixed prices. And fixed prices existed on Wall Street from fixed commissions for sales from 1792 until the 1970s. So another word for guild is cartel, and cartels restrict prices. The monopoly of taxi cabs, also a cartel in restricted demand, restricted supply, and increased prices. So all these technologies have problems. The question we have to ask ourselves is the use of blockchain here, is that a tool that will, we can be confident, reduces the costs of providing trust for a particular area? Should the government or other people, voters, be leery about the possibility people could misuse technologies? Of course they should. And probably, we might have a kind of precautionary principle approach to the deployment of new technologies to do government things by saying, we just don't want to prove that it's better, it should be a lot better, right? So imagine we're moving from paper ballots to on electronic voting. And they say, the electronic voting will be better. You might say, I'm really worried about it being hacked. So it's got to be really better before we're going to do that. I would be completely fine with that because the things that I've talked about, the social welfare calculation isn't even close for something like Uber. And again, as I answered to an earlier question, it used to be the case. We lived in smaller communities. My parents grew up in a small town that their parents and their parents and their parents had grown up in. And they didn't need a lot of law. They didn't need a lot of technology to create platforms for creating interpersonal trust. It all existed as part of that society. But there was a downside. If you wanted to leave that society, good luck for you. If you were an outsider in that society, in 1950s in West Virginia, if you were black or gay or whatever, forget it. So as our society realized we could create trust in these small groups, but boy, we're way better off if people go to the cities and they can do whatever they want, but how do we create the trust? And that's where the kind of innovations I'm talking about come from. I don't want to go back to that world, and I want trust, human cooperation, to be done in the most efficient way possible. You've raised costs. She who's left has raised some cost. We need to be aware of those things. And there's still going to be an active role for government. There is the possibility that these platforms, she gave the example of racial discrimination. I wasn't particularly persuaded by that one based on my evidence, but there could be other ones where they're going to create externalities, costs imposed on people who are not part of the platform. And where that is true, government is the best solution to that collective action problem. Remains the case, and has been the case since time immemorial. Thank you all for coming and for these great questions.